Chapter 22, Vessels and Circulation. So let's start off with the blood vessels. The main function is to help distribute the blood to the body's tissues and organs, and the blood vessels originate and or terminate at the heart, which is the pumping organ that propels the blood through the blood vessels. Three categories of vessels. There are arteries, veins, and the capillaries. Arteries are always carrying blood away from the heart, with the exception of the cardiac circuit or circulation, in which case the coronary, for cardiac heart, the coronary arteries are transporting oxygenated blood to the tissue of the heart, musculature of the heart, and those are always in red. And the cardiac veins in blue are transporting the oxygen-poor blood away from the heart tissue, musculature, back into the right atrium. In terms of the other circuits or circulations, the systemic and the pulmonary, the arteries are always carrying blood away from the heart, and veins are always carrying blood to the heart. And then capillaries, which are throughout the body, are the smallest blood vessels where exchange of materials is occurring. So arteries are always carrying blood away from the heart, and veins are carrying blood on their voyage back to the heart. So artery, A, away, veins, V, blood on its voyage back to the heart. And then capillaries connect arterioles to venules, and they are the smallest blood vessels. So arteries get smaller and smaller, and they become arterioles, and arterioles branch into the capillaries in the capillary bed, and then the capillaries merge into small venules, and then they merge and become veins on the way back to the heart. So our blood vessels, arteries, are the largest blood vessels that are carrying blood away from the heart. They have elastic tissue to give them some elasticity, as we'll talk about, and they have musculature, smooth muscle, that allow them to constrict and dilate, vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Arterioles, the smaller arteries that lead to the capillary beds, they will regulate the amount of blood flow into tissues and organs, as we'll see. And then the capillaries are very thinly walled, and they're the site of exchange. Right? Oxygen, nutrients leave the blood supply, cardiovascular system at the capillaries to provide nutrients. Where's my cursor? To provide nutrients for the cells and tissues there. And then waste material and carbon dioxide diffuse into the capillaries, and those materials work their way back into the cardiovascular system to be removed by the kidneys and or lungs. So the venules, smallest veins that receive blood from the capillaries, very thinly walled, and the smaller venules merge into veins, which are also thinly walled compared to arteries. And the reason being is because the blood pressure in the veins and venules is very low, so they do not need to be as thickly walled as the corresponding arteries that do have to deal with and withstand higher blood pressure. And the veins are carrying blood on their voyage, its voyage back to the heart. Excuse me. The vasa vasorum, this is the vessels that are supplying nutrients to the blood vessels. So in a way, the blood vessels of the heart, the cardiac circuit or circulation, are transporting nutrients to the heart musculature. The vasa vasorum are blood vessels that are supplying nutrients to the musculature and the cells of the blood vessels. And they are technically living organs. Here's just a picture I found. Vasa vasorum, small blood vessels that are supplying nutrients to the musculature and the tissues of blood vessels themselves. Okay, some structural components. So the histology of the blood vessels. So the walls of the blood vessels. The walls of the blood vessels have 3 layers. As we can see in the diagrams here, they're kind of color-coded a bit for you. So the outermost layer, as we see here in tan, is the adventitia, or the tunica externa, or externalmost layer. It's predominantly connective tissue sheath, connective tissue material, and helps anchor and support the blood vessels to surrounding tissues. And it is actually proportionally thicker in veins compared to the whole thickness of the blood vessel wall than in arteries. And on a true slide, a histological slide, it's not always easy to see the thickness of the adventitia. The middle layer, the media, for middle, or the tunica media, again for middle, is predominantly smooth muscle, which allows the blood vessels to constrict and dilate, so allows for vasoconstriction and vasodilation. And it also has an external elastic membrane and elastic fibers that are predominant in the arteries for strength. And it is thickest in the arteries compared to corresponding veins, and that's very obvious in a slide, a histological preparation. And then lastly, internally, or the most internal, is the intima, or tunica intima. And it is the endothelial layer, or the endothelium of the blood vessels. And it does have a connective tissue layer underneath, and an internal elastic membrane that's much more obvious in the arteries. Okay? And on some of the models, these are obvious, the internal elastic membrane and the external elastic membrane, and in some models they're not, or they're simply absent. Okay, going into the arteries. So the elastic arteries are the ones closest to the heart. They have an abundant amount of elastic fibers. And the reason for that is when the heart contracts, right, in particular, the left ventricle contracts, the blood pushes past the aortic semilunar valves and rushes into the ascending aorta and the aortic arch. So when that blood is propelled into that artery, the artery will expand somewhat, kind of like if you imagine forcing water into a balloon, right? The balloon will expand somewhat, and the elastic material, the elastic layers, and the elastic fibers allow for that expansion. And then as the ventricles start to go into relaxation, diastole, the blood back flows a little bit, and that slaps shut the semilunar valves. So then the blood is only forced to go in one direction away from the heart, and with the recoil of the elastic tissue within the elastic arteries, that helps propel the blood forward away from the heart. Then we transition, or there's a transition to the muscular arteries. So proportionally, there's a thicker media, or tunica media, in the muscular arteries compared to the elastic arteries. So the elastic arteries are larger, thicker in diameter compared to the muscular arteries, but when you consider the blood vessel wall, the media is proportionally larger in the muscular arteries compared to the elastic arteries. So the smooth muscle in the muscular arteries predominantly, well, the smooth musculature, the greater proportion of smooth muscle in the media allows for a greater amount of vasoconstriction and dilation. Okay? And then there is still an internal elastic membrane in the muscular arteries. Then we're transitioning out to the arterioles. These blood vessels are getting pretty small, about 30 microns in diameter, or micrometers. In comparison, a red blood cell is about 8 to 9 microns in diameter. And they're fairly thinly walled because the blood pressure has dropped considerably. There is some vasoconstriction and vasodilation still possible because of the smooth muscle layers. But these blood vessels are getting very small, and they're then transition to the capillaries and the capillary beds. So the capillaries, the smallest blood vessels, site of gas and material exchange. There's only one thin layer of endothelial cells, and then a basal lamina surrounding that. So it's a thin diameter structure that allows for nice rapid diffusion of materials out, like oxygen and nutrients, hormones, and then a thin layer or thin diameter capillary that allows easy diffusion of waste materials and carbon dioxide into the capillaries. So continuous capillaries, the endothelial layer, endothelium is complete, and these are the type of capillaries found in the majority of the capillary beds in our bodily tissues. So when you think of capillaries and capillary beds, those are continuous capillaries. There's also fenestrated capillaries, which means they have holes or pores in them. The endothelium is incomplete, which means very rapid diffusion of materials. As you see here, the fenestrated capillaries, the little holes, the pores. And this allows rapid movement of material, much more so than in the continuous capillaries in the capillary beds. So the fenestrated capillaries are only found in certain locations like the choroid plexuses in the brain. Remember where the cerebrospinal fluid is generated, produced in the ventricles. Also in endocrine glands that allows ease of entry of the hormones that are secreted by the endocrine glands into the blood capillaries. Also in the kidneys and pancreas for ease of materials, release of materials due to filtration in the kidneys, and also in the capillaries. These fenestrated capillaries in the pancreas allow ease of release secretion of the pancreatic digestive enzymes and hormones. So relatively limited places where the fenestrated capillaries are found. Okay, let's transition or move and talk about the capillary beds. So you have the arterioles that lead and branch into the capillaries of the capillary beds. And then leaving the capillary beds are the venules that transition to veins, right? And then blood's on its voyage back to the heart. So the capillary beds are the sites of exchange of materials at the tissues. Blood flow is regulated to meet local demands. So what that means is, let's say this is tissue and capillary beds in, say, your leg muscles, and you find out that, you're late for the bus and you start running to catch the bus. So the demands of oxygen and nutrients for these cells increases. So your body responds by increasing the blood flow, perfusion of blood through these tissues, so that these cells can receive the oxygen and nutrients that they need in the correct amounts, and then also so that the blood can carry away the waste material and carbon dioxide efficiently. Okay? After a big meal, the blood flow is increased to the capillary beds at the digestive tract, but decreased at the capillary beds to the skeletal muscle. That whole thing about rest and digest, right? The parasympathetic activation. So so how is this regulated? There are precapillary sphincters, as you see right here, precapillary sphincter that can close down and limit the blood flow to certain areas. And if the majority of them close down, the majority of the capillary bed receives relatively little blood flow, and the blood is then just directed through the relatively few thoroughfare channel.